Hey, friends, welcome back to Shift Happens. My name is Joe Smith. I am your host and the lead pastor of an open and affirming church here in Gainesville, Florida called Shift. And with me today, I can guarantee you most of you will know this guest. And I was lucky enough to meet this guest at the time of this recording. I guess it's about a week ago at the Post Evangelical Collective conference in Raleigh, North Carolina. You probably know him from his reels and TikToks and social media. I've got Brian Recker with me today to kind of share his story and dude, it was such a pleasure, even just to getting to meet you a little bit, but sharing in that experience.
Yeah, I was
And
gonna say we didn't just meet each other, Joe. We
yeah,
wept together.
yeah,
We
we did. That was crazy.
we were crying like babies.
Dude, that was something. So for those of you that don't know, there's this new movement within the church called the Post Evangelical Collective, and they had this beautiful gathering in Raleigh, North Carolina, and then they like ended the whole session with this refrocking service, which is like this. I don't know what the right word is, recommissioning or
Yeah,
I
I mean,
don't
I think the classic idea is ordination, but it's not technically an
right.
ordination ceremony because they're not an ordination body.
Yeah.
But it was the spirit, I think, of commissioning, certainly. Um, I don't know about you, but and I guess as I unfold my story, I lost the approval of a lot of the former mentors and leaders that I looked up to. And not only did I lose it in the sense that they took it away from me, but I also took that away. I took that mantle away from them. Like I could no
Mhm.
longer look up to them. And a lot of the people that I used to look up to, I realized I'm actually profoundly disappointed in the fact that they didn't make some of these shifts and changes in order to love people. And so feeling that sense of approval and commissioning from even some of just the older folks that were in
Mhm.
that circle praying for us. I don't at this moment really have a lot of older mentor figures. Those were from my past. I had some older mentor figures that, yeah, it just moved me profoundly to feel that again. It is so important, I think, to not be on your own. And
Yeah.
PEC moment just made us feel, I think, like, yeah, there's a lot of us in this together. And even though we're doing it different ways and we use different
Mhm.
language, we're in different contexts, we don't even all have the same doctrinal statements, but there was I think a commitment to one another and to the shared values that we kind of have together that was really powerful.
It really was. Yeah, I had mentioned, I don't remember if it was you I was saying it to, or maybe it was just we were all sitting there talking afterwards, and I said, like the loss that you feel just individually, like that can be addressed. The relationships that we've had in the years since, are just so beautiful and moving, and I'm so thankful for them. They more than make up for any relationships that we lost in the past, but just like you said, there was no way to address the institutional abandonment of what we had come from within the church. Like our association completely cut us off. We lost all of those ties to the church planning networks and everything. And there was just no way to fill that void again. And
Yeah.
then they came along and did that. So yeah, that was amazing.
Yeah, and it's cool to see folks like you and I know Zach Lambert, he led his church as well through the process of becoming affirming. And as he led his church through that, and it may be similar with you as you led your church through that, his sort of previous support networks and that sort of thing removed their support, removed their approval, removed
Yeah.
denominational affiliation, that sort of thing. He was basically kicked out of everything. That was not my experience. I really removed myself. Um, I was a site pastor as well, not
Yeah.
a
Yeah,
so I
let's
was
jump into it. So where were you
yeah.
at? What was the
Okay.
context?
So I mean I'll just kind of go I'll go all the way back. I did
Do
not
it.
grow up in evangelicalism. I actually grew up in fundamentalism.
Okay.
My dad is an independent fundamental Baptist pastor still to this day.
Free Will
Uh,
Baptist. Really
Okay.
close.
Yeah, pretty close. Super conservative, King
Yep.
James only, no rock and roll music at all, including CCM. Like Chris Tomlin and Stephen Curtis Chapman were too liberal for what I grew up in. Like it was like hymns only, sacred music, we called it.
I feel
Um,
that.
and my dad went to Bob Jones. I went to Bob Jones, following his footsteps, not really because I was passionate about it, but because my parents strongly desired me to go. There was kind of the sense that like there would be sort of financial support if I went that direction. They didn't really explicitly say that, but I was not really in a place of being a rebellious guy. I had been homeschooled. My world was very small prior to college. Um, at school, at Bob Jones, I actually met some evangelicals, even though it's a fundamentalist school. I kind of did not connect well with the other fundamentalists. I think I just Yeah, they were fucking dweebs, man. Like I was just, these were horrible ethos there. I could write a whole book just about my time at Bob Jones. That place was insane.
I believe
The
it.
the people that were like seen as the spiritual leaders, the way that you got like spiritual authority, you became like a prayer captain on your hall or whatever, was by turning other people in for breaking rules. Like you
That's awesome.
basically they rewarded being a narc. Um, so yeah, not a great place. I fell in with the sort of rebellious crowd, and some of those were more like mainstream evangelicals who weren't fundamentalists, who just found themselves above Jones. And so my kind of first step of becoming more progressive was becoming an evangelical.
That's awesome.
Um, started listening to like Tim Keller and kind of got into the Gospel Coalition crowd. Um,
That's so funny to me. I don't want to interrupt, but that your
no, go ahead.
deconstruction started with the Gospel Coalition.
Yeah, it
That's
did.
what you
Yeah.
deconstructed into.
Into Mark
Yeah.
Driscoll was one of the early, we're talking like 2004 Mark Driscoll, right?
You know what? I do remember that. Same. Listen
Yeah, I
to him
mean, who
too.
among us,
Yeah.
before I throw a
100%.
stone at anyone, I have to acknowledge that, in 2004, Brian thought Mark Driscoll was really fucking cool
Yep.
because he
Same.
said damn from the stage at
Yeah.
church. But what appealed to me at the time was that people like him wore what they wanted. They maybe had tattoos, would drink a beer, would smoke a cigar, and yet they still had the same fundamental theology. And so it made me feel like, oh, I don't have to be a compromiser to these things that I was taught. I don't have to question everything. I don't have to throw the whole thing away. I can just be like more normal and
Yeah.
still believe. I can listen to the music that I want to listen to and that sort of thing. And also, the gospel that was being preached by those guys like Tim Keller was more Jesus oriented than what I grew up in, which was literally just performance. The fundamentalism that I grew up in was all just rules. And I think we can say that evangelicalism has a lot of rules, and they do, but at least they try to talk more about grace, certainly than some fundamentalist sects like the
Yeah.
one I um, so that for a time was very refreshing, and it actually gave me the passion to maybe even do ministry for the first time. Like when you're raised as a preacher's kid, everybody's always asking if you're going to be a preacher like your daddy, and my answer was always no, because within fundamentalism, it was never appealing to me. Seemed pretty ugly. Um, but when I started like listening to Tim Keller, who, he has a very intellectual approach
Yeah.
to evangelicalism, which at the time was incredibly refreshing. Now looking back, it's incredibly frustrating. And I realized that the way that he put so much nuance on evangelical dogma to try to make it sound really appealing kept me evangelical way longer than I should have been. Like I should have
Yeah.
seen it for what it was a lot sooner, but because there were figures like him that were really good at like spinning it and nuancing it and polishing the turd of evangelicalism really well, it actually kept me in a lot longer. So I'm kind of mad at him for that.
That's a good way to
But
put it, though. No, no, no.
yeah,
That's right. That's an excellent way to put it.
it is what it is. And I think actually I inherited that from him. As I became an evangelical pastor, that's what I became pretty good at too, because I felt like I had to believe these things. And so what I found myself constantly doing was trying to figure out how to make these things, like the idea of, the evangelical gospel, really the central aspect of that gospel is like penal substitutionary atonement, which is a pretty ugly thing when you describe it in like when you just describe it. It's pretty ugly. Like God
Yes.
punishes uh God's son instead of us because we all deserve punishment. We're all born worthy of infinite hell. And so, Jesus receives punishment from a punishing God because somebody has to be punished. Like that's a bad story, but listening to people like Keller, you learn how to massage that story to try to make it sound as good as possible. So rather than actually using our imaginations and discovering like a good gospel, I was like spending my energy trying to make a bad gospel sound
Mm.
good.
Mm-hmm. I feel that.
And you can apply that to, I
Oh
think,
yeah.
queer issues as well. Like when it came to trying to explain the Bible's sexual ethic, it was very similar sort of dance that I was feeling like I had to constantly be doing.
So at what point did that shift begin to happen for you? Like, wait a second, okay, the veneer is beginning to, you know, come off of the turd. Like, when
Yeah.
did it start for you?
Donald Trump, baby.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, yeah.
2015. Hats off to that guy. Um, I think a lot of us saw the world more clearly as a result of Donald Trump. I think
That's very true.
it's almost like, it reminds me of the way the prophets use such crazy language to describe global events. And it's to wake people up. And Donald Trump was like, he's like the book of Revelation, man. Like, you can't paint a picture more vivid as to like the greed at the center of you know, the domination system that is America. Like he just embodied, I think, many of the demons of our country. The way
Hmm,
that we exclude people, the white supremacy, the patriarchy, the sexism, homophobia, transphobia. It's like all, I think all the demons. He's kind of like this antichrist figure in that way, you know?
that
And
is, I have never thought about it like that. Yeah, but that's it. That's perfect.
but I think there was a positive result in that. I mean, obviously, I wouldn't, you know, I'm not glad
Right.
that it happened, but I think the redemptive aspect, at least in just my personal life, was that I had blinders on. My head was in the sand
Mm-hmm.
about so much, and I would say even politically, like I was a moderate conservative at the time,
Mm-hmm.
going into that election, and that was just a thoughtless position. I was raised as a conservative. I grew up, my parents listened to Rush Limbaugh every single day. I had Rush
Yep.
Limbaugh just going on in the background of my life growing up. I
I
was
feel that.
homeschooled and we listened to Rush Limbaugh for social studies. That was like my social studies elective, basically.
That's awesome. Wow. Yeah, yeah.
Dark, dark shit.
Yeah, yeah.
But so yeah, I think that caused me to all of a sudden be like, well, hold on, this is not good. This is, in fact, explicitly bad. He is bad. I can't go that direction. Seeing all of the Republican Party like line up behind him, seeing people just shift their positions. You know, my dad, who sat me down and explained after the Monica Lewinsky scandal how like character matters in the White House and this whole thing. Like, I literally got a whole speech. I remember it vividly because it was the day I learned what a blowjob was. I
Yeah, yeah.
learned what a blowjob was in my kitchen after Rush Limbaugh used the term, and I asked what it was. And my dad sat me down and gave me this whole speech about the importance of integrity. And then that same man, now, you know, a decade plus later, is telling me, is defending the Access Hollywood tape and, you know, calling it locker room talk, you know? Seeing that shift, for so many made me just realize, well, a few things. I think it was just a mask off sort of thing that, like, oh, this is just about power. I think also it made me realize I've been like, what's the word? I've been like giving away my discernment to
Mm,
other people, like
mm.
you know, outsourcing. That was the word I was searching for. I've been outsourcing my discernment to people, and letting them tell me what I should believe about some of these things. And that in that moment, I realized these people don't actually have discernment. Um, and I need to actually start listening to what, you know, and start seeing this for myself. And so I did. I began to, it really started with a political shift. I really started looking at like why I believed what I believed politically. Why was I a moderate or conservative? And that journey over the next couple of years, I mean, I became a socialist essentially when I started to actually think about it for myself. And that was, you know, I mean, that was a big deal in that movement because, you know, socialist, that's like a bad word in the evangelical
Yeah.
church.
Scary.
Yeah, you might as well say you're an atheist, I guess,
Yeah.
if you're a pastor and you're a socialist. So I mean, I was closeted about this. I was like, I created an alternate Twitter account, you know, so that I could tweet socialist ideas because they were in my head and I wanted to talk about them, but
That's
I
awesome.
couldn't be myself in that.
Well, that was what I was going to ask was like you're having this profound shift of like not only like political ideology, but you're looking. I mean, it's a worldview now that you're moving.
Right.
Are you employed by a church? Are you a pastor at this time?
Yeah. So for sure, I didn't quit until 2020.
Okay.
2015 is kind of when this journey started. And for the first few years there, I think I was just kind of wrestling with some cognitive dissonance, kind of feeling like this first time I was really feeling distance between where I was at and where evangelicalism was at. And then over the next few years, as I began to evolve, I felt like I was in a really cool position to challenge people
Mm.
to from within, you know, not just preaching to the choir, not just talking to people that already agree with me about everything like everybody else seems to do, but actually be a part of change. And, you know, yeah, then they're listening to Fox News and Sean Hannity every single night. But on Sunday mornings, I could talk to them about like Jesus's inclusive love and, you know, what it means to like love our neighbors, even ones at the southern border and that sort of thing. And that felt good for a little while, but I think I was lying to myself the extent to which there were limits as to what I could say, and I
Hmm.
was censoring myself constantly. And I knew that there were like certain lines I could never cross, like being affirming. If I did that, then it would be like, oh, well, then you're out completely, you know? And so I I kept myself from going there because that would mean losing my job. And I don't think like front of mind knew that I was doing that.
Hmm.
I don't know that we're those of us who are in that system and under the institutional pressure of not just the finances that our monthly paycheck depends on us continuing to believe a certain set of beliefs. And if we change them, then we lose, we lose that job, we lose our salary, but also just the web of relationships. I mean, everybody I knew was in that world. They supported me. They helped me move. They were there when my babies were born. Like it was a whole family, not just in my church, but also we were part of a network of churches and we would go to conferences and I knew people at these other churches. If I was ever going to leave and plant another church, I figured it would be within that network because they knew me, I knew them. It was a whole thing to like change on one issue to just say, hey, you know what? I think gay people are okay. Just to do that would be to lose all of it, the whole thing. And so when you go to study that issue, what are you going to do? Well, you're naturally going to read the books like Preston Sprinkle's book that are going to reinforce
Yeah.
the position that is safe.
Yeah.
And so, the irony is people, after I've changed my mind on this and now fully affirm, queer people, I get sometimes people say, oh, you just took the easy way out. People say that all the time. And it is so funny because there's nothing easy about if you're in evangelical, there's nothing easy on telling everyone you know, everyone you love, everyone who loves you, I'm sorry, I can't be a part of this anymore. I'm going to lose all of it to like, I didn't even have gay friends when I first made that decision, Like you're kind of making that shift away from the people that you know and love towards a big question mark, knowing that it's just the right thing to open your heart.
I
That's
do
not true.
know.
I did have a few gay friends actually. I
Yeah.
shouldn't say, but it is a step of faith for people a lot of times. And it's funny that it's often painted as like capitulating to the culture when it's the opposite. It's incredibly courageous, I think, for people to do that.
Yeah, and I think it brings up a really good point. Like we've mentioned it here before, and I know other people talk about it too, but that idea that like those relationships are all based on right belief, and as long as you believe these certain core tenets, then you can still be part of the club. But the moment that you move, boy, and you can move a little bit on some of them, but there are lines in the sand, and if you start to approach that or like I can remember in my own journey, I had to go to people that I knew were affirming and I knew them, they were acquaintances, to ask questions because I knew if I asked questions of the people around me, number one,
Mm.
I knew what they already thought. But number two, I knew it would bring a conversation I wasn't ready to have yet.
Right.
Like employment and those kinds of things. So like I had to go outside of anybody that was in my circle to just ask a question because it was just, hey, I'm curious about this. What do you think about this? And
Oh
but
yeah,
to
you
even do
can't be
that,
curious. Right. Yeah, no, that kind of curiosity would be seen as, divisive potentially.
yeah.
It's interesting which issues end up in that closed hand versus the open hand too, because when you look at it, it's not like, oh, I see. Yeah, the ones that are best represented in scripture are the non-negotiables, and the ones that are very, flexible or not really represented in scripture are the ones that are up for negotiation. No, it doesn't really work like that. It
No, it
is more
doesn't.
like the things that are decided as culturally button issues and like the people that we want to keep out, those are in the closed hand. Um, because yeah, queer issues, that doesn't necessarily, people talk like that's shifting that as like a fundamental of the faith, and it's simply not. It doesn't really affect any other major doctrines.
Mm-mm.
Some Christians will try to say, like, I've heard the argument that like if you endorse same-sex relationships, same-sex marriages, then it undermines the metaphor of Christ's love for the church, which is apparently a very heterosexual love. Like, what? um, yeah, what is heteronormative about Jesus, like us, like dudes being called the bride of Christ? First
Yeah,
of all,
yeah.
there's nothing heteronormative about that. But the argument is that like the core of the gospel, like they have to change the gospel to make it about this relationship where the church has to be a woman and Jesus is a man. And so now you have a heterosexual relationship. And so that's marriage. And so that means marriage is a reflection of the gospel, which means that if you allow gay people to get married, you're ruining the gospel. That is such a leap, a logical leap that's not spelled out in scripture anywhere. It's totally fucking made up. But I've heard that argument multiple times as why this is a gospel issue, because that's what they ultimately have to say. Because otherwise, it's like, why not just agree to disagree? Why not just say, hey, of course, gay married people can be full members of the church, even if I might have a personal opinion about it. We can leave this ambiguous. Why not just be like that at the worst case? But no, they have to draw this line so starkly and say this is a gospel issue. And the reason they have to do that is because ultimately the position would be untenable if they said
Mm.
okay, come in, I'll just agree to disagree. It would be so apparent very quickly, oh, you're just a bigot, actually. Like, otherwise, just get on, just like be a part of this, you know?
Yeah.
Because once you're up close and personal with gay people in their relationships, it's very, I mean, that to me is the main reason too why they have the whole thing about don't go to these weddings, right? Like that's another big thing. Like they don't, evangelical pastors do not want you to go to gay weddings. Even if it's your son or daughter getting married, they'll say that you're endorsing their sin. You're not endorsing anything. To go to a wedding, you're just standing with somebody on their special day. I think you should endorse it. But like, even if you can't endorse it, you should go and be happy and smile and be there and be present. And the reason they don't want you to do it is because they know that you'll see how normal and beautiful it is. And you'll probably change your mind because that's what relationships do. They change us.
Boom. Yeah, you're 100%. And looking back on it now, I think one of the reasons, that whole right belief thing, and like you said, you've got this whole network of people. I think that's part of the reason. I don't know if it started out this way, but I know that it definitely ended up this way, where, you find your relationships. Everything is centered within the church. Whatever your church is, it's centered there. And I think part of it is because they can reinforce you get reinforced in your own set of beliefs, and then all of a sudden you've got these people out here and they're queer, and no, you can't go out there. Why? Because all of a sudden I'm going to have relationships and I'm going to see, wait, these people aren't what you're saying from the stage. As a matter of fact, I think many of them are quite beautiful, and I find, you know what I mean? And all of a
They're the
sudden,
best.
yeah, it just starts to fall apart. And it's like, wait a second. These people don't care that I'm in the church. They don't want to drag me to hell. They're not trying to prove me wrong. They literally don't care one
Yeah.
way or the other. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's
So wait, I
fascinating.
forget where I was in my story, but
So yeah,
well, yeah, I was reevaluating some of these
that's
things
it.
from within, and it really was the pause of COVID. I think 2020 is when I put the end of 2020 is when I put in my resignation. I really, during that year, it was when Sunday's always coming, it's again, it's like hard to really reevaluate your life and take a major step like that because it's
Yep.
like you're just always in the grind, writing another sermon or whatever. So that big pause really just made me think about who I was, what I was a part of, if I really was going to live my whole life in that state of like being in something that I didn't really feel fully represented, not only the heart of Jesus, but also even just where I was at. So I was having to adapt myself in some ways, and I wasn't being my fully authentic self. And I was also curious who I would be outside of it because I didn't even I realize now like I wasn't even aware to the extent to which I was doing that, because until those like pressures of you have to be this
Hmm.
way were off of me. Um yeah, it was interesting to see where that went. So I really wasn't sure what I was going to do during the time that we were paused. When we regathered in the fall of 2020, he started again meeting in person. I remember going into the room and just feeling like, oh no, 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 I can't do this. Something had just shifted in me during that time, and so I put in my resignation, moved. Our family moved to Raleigh in the next year,
Oh, so you
and
live
yeah,
there?
I lived in Eastern North Carolina, and I
Okay.
moved to Raleigh, just a couple hours away. So it was just a little shift, but like, yeah, I would recommend this too for those of you who are maybe in a similar, if you're in a situation where like you feel like there is a certain pressure on you to be a certain way, and you're ready to deconstruct, you're ready to make some changes, but you just don't know that you have the courage to make those changes. Getting away, like
Mm.
physically moving away from that space, I think was a really important step for me to be able to be. I don't know that I could have made certain changes and done certain things if I was going to have to see all those people every day at the grocery store in my small town. I really did need to feel a sense of freedom that I wasn't in the fishbowl, that I didn't have the spotlight on me anymore. Even though they watched me on social media, I knew they were still watching, but I could kind of just be like, okay, I'm not going to worry about that at all. Um, and so it was about a year after I quit or moved that I began to, well, I put something out online because I was a part of a non-affirming church, and so it felt important for me to kind of state publicly my support for queer people, since I had previously had a public stance of being non-affirming. And so I wrestled with that for a long time. I mean, it was yeah, it was over a year that I knew that I wanted to do that, but I was just giving myself some grace to like, I think like let those relationships feel a little like I could hold them looser before I did it because I knew I would lose a lot of those relationships. So since I had that distance during that year, by the end of that year, even though I hadn't made any major changes, yeah, like those relationships didn't seem as important to me. And so I knew that it was going to be hard still, but it seemed worth it at that point for my own integrity. And by that time, yeah, I did have some gay friends as well, and like their opinion mattered more. I think that's important. So yeah, when I did like a series of videos on why Christians should support same-sex relationships, and immediately my church took down all my sermons from their website and sent out like an email about me and that sort of thing. And that's not like me to say like I'm some martyr or something. I knew that that was probably going to happen, and yeah, I mean, I think that's a small price to pay for
Hmm.
doing the right thing, something that should have been done, a long time ago. So, but that did make me feel like a sense of I didn't have anything to lose at that point. Like, why at this point would I, you know, curate any of my self and personality and beliefs around what evangelicals are going to approve of? They've already like literally, I just said that one thing and it was like, boom, you're done, taken off completely. And so at that point, I just kind of let myself be incredibly curious. And I've also just been kind of sharing very openly my thoughts around my own deconstruction. Um, and yeah, I don't know. The rest is history, I guess. Like I think I think there's an appetite for really vulnerable, authentic curiosity in,
Hmm.
in a public space of people saying, that, um, yeah, like we're free to use our imaginations and actually use our intuition about some of this stuff too, which was not something I think either of us were taught
Hmm.
probably.
Yeah. Two observations, two things that I think are one is I think a shared experience amongst a large group of people, and the other one is yeah. Uh, but it is interesting to me that you physically moved, and there have been so many stories that where we've done where people specifically queer people though have had to like leave that space that they were at and go to a like physical different location for their body to just be like, okay, now we can deal with this. And it's interesting that you had to do the exact same thing, that distance, those miles, those hours, you're still in the same state, but you're just not where your body, like at home, your body couldn't do this. And now all of a sudden you have a new
Mm,
space and your body's like, okay, now we can do
that's a
this.
good point.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't want to ever try to act like I could ever understand the coming out journey because I know that
Right.
that's a very specific emotional journey that, the queer community deals with and that can be really challenging. That being said, I think we all straight people can learn from the way that they come out. In that sense, like they often, in order to come out, they usually have to just decide that they're okay. They're accepting the fact that a lot of people are going to reject them because of
Hmm.
that. They're choosing to be true to who they are at the expense of the people that they know that will reject them. And then they're trusting that there will be people who accept them on the other side of that, accept the real, the more true and authentic version of them. And at that point, then they're also really good at finding chosen family, as opposed to because often they're experiencing rejection from their biological families. So I think pastors, who are making that shift from non-affirming to affirming, even if they're not gay, they can learn from that coming out journey in like counting the cost, but recognizing that it's more important to be authentic, it's more important to be true, it's more important to be loving than it is to, receive the acceptance from those people. And then, just trust that you will find your chosen family, whether that's in ministry or out of
Hmm.
ministry, that your ministry is not going to die. Like we experienced that at PEC, I think that we're not dead, and we still have like things to do for the kingdom of God in a more true and wholehearted place. Um, and so
Yeah.
it's always good to come out to yourself, whatever that looks like.
Yeah. And I think too that's, you mentioned it just a second ago. I think that's part of the appeal of accounts like yours where maybe you're not saying these things from a stage and a pulpit anymore, but you still have this audience. And just like you said, this real authenticity, this realness to it. And I think a lot of people are drawn towards that. this next iteration. I, I mean, you can just take the church language out of it, but just this realness, this authenticity, this reclaiming, right? This remaking. We say that all the time here. It's in our undoing that we are remade. And I think a lot of people are in that undoing and trying to figure out, and so then they gravitate towards good and bad, right? Like I know you get it too, but and it's totally worth it, but just being able to be who you are, there's so much healing in that. And I think that's why so many people are drawn to, accounts like yours, and because you speak to that and you're very open and honest. Like we said beforehand, you just had a video the other day where you're sitting in your car and you just handed your kids off. It was that transition time and you didn't want to go home. So you did pottery. And that was it.
Yeah.
And it was okay. Like there's no resolution.
Yeah. That's true. Yeah, yeah, that's interesting. I'm always nervous when I do one like that because I don't want to like be like I'm whining publicly or like just like a woe is me account. Like that's not the point of that. I do think that like well, yeah, I mean, there's a few things. I think it's good for people to see men like be vulnerable. I think
Mm,
that that's not like I think guys we
yep.
have all the same feelings, but we're not often good at processing them or talking about them. But it's actually okay for us to feel our feelings. Um, and yeah, not everything does need to be resolved. It's okay to like have a like this is a bad thing and
Yeah.
this feels bad. And that can be. We always had to put a bow on everything. I don't feel
Mm.
the need to do that anymore. Now that I'm not an evangelical pastor. So yeah, I actually appreciate you saying
That's
that.
very true. I just listened to I started listening to some different music and I just finished Derek Webb's album from last year, The
Cool.
Jesus Hypothesis. And he's got this song. It's the very last song, I'm Still Here. And the song ends unresolved. He
Hmm.
doesn't finish the sentence. And it ends almost in discord. And the whole song is about the undoing, like the is this whole conversation. But it just like while we were sitting here talking, I was thinking about that because I listened to it this morning. I finished it, and it's just that, yeah, that's where so many of us are now. It is. It's just unresolved.
And being like open even about that. I think
Yep.
people are often nervous to share until they land somewhere very like they
Mm.
want to land at the same level of certainty that they used to have when they were
Oh
evangelical,
man.
and they're waiting to talk. And I think a lot of pastors who have deconstructed are waiting to share when they arrive at a new place of certainty. Like, oh, now that I've landed somewhere, let me give you the new spiel. And for me, I'm always trying to say like I'm not a spiritual guru in the sense of like here I've got, oh, you were evangelical, well I've got a new set of dogmas for you, like this is the new way that we should all be looking at it. I I don't I think I'm pretty agnostic on a lot of things at this point. I
Mm.
don't know that I'll ever land anywhere in the way that I landed in evangelicalism. I'm nervous to ever plant a flag like that again, because I know what it does. As soon as you say this is where I'm at, and what then you build an institution around it that then locks you into that, so that if you change, you're going to lose a whole bunch more people and a salary, and like that, it would be ridiculous. I don't want to build that again. I think instead, um, yeah, to be open to change as a part of maturity, as a part of growth. I think people are also nervous about changing in public because change can be, well, it's embarrassing to admit, yeah, I was
Mhm.
wrong about that. And especially if you're a pastor, like, oh, I was publicly wrong about that. I was paid to be wrong about that
Yeah, for
even.
real.
And so to admit that and then to say like here's another way of thinking about it, you're afraid that you're going to be called all kinds of things, which yeah, maybe you will. I have been called many things and that's fine. But I don't I think I'm convinced that to not change is more embarrassing in some ways.
Mm.
Like to say, "Oh yeah, no, when I was 23, I figured it all out and I never had to grow or change about anything because I stumbled into all the answers when I was 23 years old." Like no, like I became a pastor at 25 and I had the courage and fortitude to recognize at 33 that I had been wrong for a long time about a lot of things. And to come out of that and then though to have the courage to also speak about that and say that you were wrong without knowing exactly like again like here's not now it's not like I was wrong but here's the rock solid answers about everything now like that to me I think is a scary thing for people but I think it's important because I think that's where most people are at, and they need to know that it's okay to be there.
Hmm.
I think so many people are like they've left, they're disenfranchised with evangelicalism, but they haven't landed. They don't even know that they're allowed to go to like a progressive church or something because they're thinking like, oh, I'm not sure if I believe that, you know. I might be leaving Christianity behind completely. I don't know. There were parts of it I like, but I don't want to go there and think that I have to now like be fully bought
Hmm.
into this other thing. And that's okay. Like I think it's important for us to like kind of give that place of uncertainty. That might be where we live for the rest of our lives, and we can still be faithful in that place. Like
Yeah.
we can still live out, I think, the way of Jesus even without knowing. I don't know that it matters to me a lot of the specifics, you know. I leave a lot of ambiguity, I think, for a lot of the details around what spiritual significance did the cross actually accomplish? Was there a literal empty tomb or not? Like I wasn't there. I know that I've been impacted by the story and the spirit of Jesus, and I believe that like we can live those things out and live with question marks, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny that you use the word agnostic because when people ask me, I often use that I'm a Christian agnostic. So I find so much beauty and good fruit, if you want to use that language, in the story of Jesus, the way he lived his life out, and then the way that impacts mine and what we do here. I attribute spiritual things to those, right? Like but I am fully aware that I'm choosing to believe that. Like these things that I'm talking about now. Like I choose to believe them knowing that, you know what? The whole thing could be made up. True.
Yeah.
100%. Yeah, but yes and not, either or to me.
Yeah, and the people who say that, oh, if it was all made up, then what's to stop us from just, raping and pillaging
Oh my
and
gosh.
it's like, oh, so you don't actually believe any of it then.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so for me, it's like, no, I believe it. I believe it. It's true for me, regardless of
Right.
the historicity of what, like, I can't prove any of that. I've decided that this way of love makes sense. The Jesus story gives me language for it,
Yep.
but it doesn't, that's not the only way to talk about it, you
Yep.
know? That's the way I grew. That's the like lingua franca sort of that I was raised with, and a way that, I can describe the story of God and the world. But I mean, I deeply believe still that, and part of this is because I have had some experiential, mystical experiences
Mhm.
of God's presence, feeling very much that we are all deeply connected to one another and
Mm-hmm.
to everything that God created, and that love does bind it all together. Um, and so I think I believe that. I believe that there is a God of love that we are all connected to one big connected thing through. And then the Jesus story helps me, I think, just have language for a way of living in that reality, right? Like, well, what is that? What is the nature of it? And I think it's still a good one, the Jesus story and the Jesus's way of spirituality, not just the religion about Jesus, but the spirituality of Jesus and how that's lived out. I think that makes sense because it was about being connected to God and other people and to ourselves. And so I'm still like wrestling through for, in a lot of ways, what that spirituality looks like for me. And a lot of the ways that I used to talk about it still work, and a lot of the ways that I used to talk about it don't work.
Hmm. Yeah. It is interesting to me too that the language that you're using is a lot of the language that's, if you want to look at our broader culture, I don't know if you have ever read Richard Rohr or any of his
Oh, yeah.
work, but he often talks about order, disorder, reorder. And
Hmm.
Brian McLaren is simplicity, complexity, perplexity, and harmony. But they're all essentially saying the same things. And if you look around our culture right now, there's a lot of disorder. It's a lot of undoing. And I think the opposition to that is just that doubling down of fundamentalism. And it's being seen, it comes out in various ways. We're seeing it in legislature. It's really targeted at trans people. It's really targeted at the LGBTQ plus community. There are other things, but they seem to be the biggest scapegoat. And even now, like just this past week, you're seeing these prominent evangelicals like going after Taylor Swift's new album, right? Well, I listened to it. I loved every single song. That woman can write a lyric, but the whole album is disorder. The whole album is the pain that was handed to her, and they're complaining about the words she uses to describe the pain and not addressing the things that cause the pain.
Hmm.
And I think that's just where we're at. Church, culture, all of it. It's just one group of people are all in this undoing and remaking, and everybody that's still in order hates it, and
Yeah.
they're gonna scream about it.
Right. That's interesting. No, it's true that I mean, yeah, it's the word deconstruction, right? And there's a
Yeah.
big I think that I am glad to see that evangelicals are finally taking it seriously. There was a, like a book recently called The Deconstruction of Christianity, and like evangelicals are talking about deconstruction now. They're trying to combat it. What they're not doing, I think, is really listening and recognizing that they need to, I think, adapt to some of these very legitimate critiques. Not just like, I think what they're doing a lot of times is they're just focusing on like, okay, yeah, we can see how this harmed you because it was done this way in a hypocritical way, like, cover ups like the SBC sex abuse cover
Oh,
up and stuff like that. Like that's obviously bad. But what they've not done, I think, is own how actually the theology they need to
mhm.
be more flexible on. I think well, it's just not a honest. Yeah, I think I'm just so glad that I can just be honest about the Bible now too. Like when I was an evangelical, I was like aware that there were parts of the Bible that bothered me, and I was never fully intellectually satisfied with many of the justifications that we would get in order to understand these things from an inerrancy perspective. But I had to double down on those because there didn't seem to be another option. We were given a framework of if you don't believe in inerrancy, if you believe there's any mistakes in the Bible, you got to throw the whole thing away.
Yeah.
It's all or nothing.
Yeah.
And I never liked that. It didn't feel right, and it didn't sit with me. But it wasn't until I really did make my break with it and step away that I was all of a sudden that pressure was off to conform to this particular way of approaching the Bible, and I could just be honest about the way that I already intuitively knew we were supposed to approach the Bible as a wisdom book that points us to God, imperfect stories about God as told by God's imperfect children, that can, of course, be a source of spiritual strength and edification as these people, to not have the humility to think that these people who came before us also had revelations of God and can that we can learn from and enter into, but to think that that's the end all be all, that God's not talking today, that God's spirit only worked then, but couldn't be like speaking to even me right now, or that they got it all right is ridiculous. And I think we know that intuitively, but we weren't allowed to believe that from within the evangelical framework. So it's nice to be honest about that too. And then I don't have to throw away everything, right? I can keep anything that I want to keep.
Yeah. Well, and then you can also, in being honest, you can say things like, no, that's wrong. Like, no,
Right.
that's not okay. This is not okay, and we're gonna leave it where it's at,
Right.
and be fine with it.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it does seem to me like I'm curious to know if there is going to be yeah, I guess a progressive Christian movement at the level of evangelicalism, on the other side of this, because it does seem like those kinds of really hard and fast dogmatic ways of approaching the Bible, it keeps people, it makes them feel safe in some ways.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, people don't always do great with ambiguity and uncertainty. It's maybe less
No.
appealing in some ways, but I find it very liberating. And I think it's much more honest, certainly.
I do now. I do
Yeah.
now. I didn't for the longest time because what I tried to do was is because I'm very in my head. And so when I started my deconstruction process, especially when it came to queer inclusion, I was reading everything. Like I was reading God and the Gay Christian, and then I,
Mhm.
read Kathy Baldock's work, and then I read like Dr. Gushy, and it was just like, these thick books, and I'm diving into like especially Dr. Gushy and Kathy Baldock. I mean, she dives into the etymology of these words, and then he's
Right.
talking about like, all this Greek culture and everything, but but letting go of the structure of fundamentalism was really difficult for me. I tried to keep the structure and just like dress it up and with different doctrine or different thinking or different worldview or whatever, but it was
Right.
still the same system. And it
Yeah.
wasn't until I realized, oh, I'm deconstructing my beliefs, but not the system that it's built on. I was still trying to find the right answers. They were just different ones. But that took me that
No, that's
took me a little
important.
bit. Yeah.
I think that's really important. And that's why sometimes it can be hard to have like a dialogue with an evangelical because there's like different premises there about even how to approach the Bible. Like
Hmm.
if they want to argue proof text and like, well, what about this verse? Like that's a gotcha. And it's like, Yeah, like I could probably do some work on it and find out some cultural background to poke some holes in your way of interpreting that verse. But at the end of the day, I don't even know that I need to do that work. I can just read it
Yep.
and say, oh, I don't agree with that.
Yeah.
Like, you know what I'm saying?
I
What about
do.
that?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And so that's a tough thing for people, but I think that's an important shift because
Yeah.
we don't have to, it's not just for me, part of deconstruction has been we're not just playing by the same rules and we've come to some different conclusions. I think we have deconstructed some of those rules and said that these rules were actually confining and not just because, and you know what they'll say is, oh, it's just because you want to like you just want to sin. And if
Right.
by sin you mean, you know, be an authentic version of myself and allow our queer brothers and sisters to be authentic versions of themselves, then yeah, I guess. But that it's so much more than that. It's also like not to be controlled by also not the truth. Like to me, it's like just be honest about what the Bible actually is. Like rather than have a very ignorant perspective that is there's a framework. It's like don't it's like the emperor has no clothes. It's that's
Yep.
that classic story, right? Where it's like everybody's pretending that you're not seeing what you're seeing. In this case, the naked emperor is like a Bible verse where God says to kill Canaanite babies.
Yeah.
And we're just supposed to look at that and say, yeah, the Bible's inerrant and you know, it's I'm sure it's fine. I'm sure everything's
Yeah.
fine. I'm sure we have to take that verse just as seriously as the verse where Jesus says to love your neighbors. I'm sure those two coexist in the same universe just fine. That is such like we're not being honest about what the Bible is showing us it is. Like let's just open our eyes and be honest about it. And then we can really love the Bible for what it is, gain spiritual value from it, not from like a fake version of it that we've, you know, concocted, but actually from what it actually is. Yeah, I don't know. I'm
Yeah.
going on this.
No, 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 that's a great tangent because you're not wrong. And it speaks to, I think, like you mentioned a second ago, like the dissonance that happens when you try to have a conversation because you're starting from two different places. But I I asked myself yesterday, I had a conversation and I asked people, what would have happened had in our formative years of faith as, children or whatever, had we been taught to love ourselves instead of hate ourselves, that voice that we hear is good and can be sacred and isn't the devil, isn't sinful, and we're not inherently wrong, but we're inherently good. Like, what would have happened to us developmentally? Like, what would the conversations be like now if that was our starting point versus the one that we were given in all kinds of things, right? Just,
Mhm.
what would it be like now? I wonder. I don't have an answer,
Me too.
but
I think it
I,
would
I
be a good thing.
yeah.
I
So let me
do.
ask, yeah, go ahead. I don't want to
No,
interrupt.
no, no. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I was just going to ask, so I mean, obviously you're very uh honest, you're out there, you're putting that stuff out there, and it's all really, really good content. So if anybody's listening, and we'll have the links in the show notes later for them to do, but go follow Brian. But you find you're obviously in a very different place than you were. So, you know, um, what's life like now? Like, and all the good and the bad and anything in between. What's Brian doing now?
Well, I'm working on a book.
I
So I've been
saw that.
writing right now. Very brief description is I'm writing about how the doctrine of hell really has corrupted Christian spirituality. So
Ooh, I
many
like
of us
that.
we learned not just the doctrine of hell, like the doctrine of hell is like, you know, you were born inherently sinful and you're going to go to hell. God's going to, unless you, you know, are converted and become a born again Christian, then you will suffer in hell forever. That's like the doctrine, but there's like a spirituality of hell that creates where what's you know, it affects our relationship with God, the way we view ourselves, the way we view our neighbors. And I think it really does set us up for failure and create a spirituality that's based on fear and punishment rather than on love. And so that was the spirituality that I inherited. And what I'm discovering is that as I deconstruct hell and I talk to people about, yeah, I don't believe God's going to punish us. I don't believe that God is punishing. People are so confused. They're like, what's even the point? What is the point of the gospel? What's the point of Jesus? What's the point of the cross? If it's not to avoid hell, why does any of it matter? In other words, spirituality is fundamentally about punishment avoidance. And once you remove, oh, no, no, God's not going to punish you. Why be spiritual? We don't have a spirituality of love. We don't have a
Yeah.
positive vision for spirituality inside of Christianity. Well, I mean, I think the broader Christian tradition
Right.
does, but I
Yeah.
think for many of us, the evangelical conservative Christianity that we inherited did not have a positive vision for spirituality outside of punishment avoidance. So, kind of deconstructing not only the
Love it.
doctrine of hell, but the spirituality of hell, and showing how we can replace, I think, some of those foundational spiritual, I think, things that we embodied of fear and punishment, and replace those things with the spirituality of love and connection.
Oh, I love that. I I read a lot about that kind of topic, and I think of all of the books on the afterlife and hell that I read, there might be one that that comes close to that. I don't know that that's a topic that's been talked about a lot. I think that's really,
I hadn't read it before. I
yeah,
think it does because I'm fine. Yeah, I've read a bunch of books about hell as well, and it's usually
yeah,
deconstructing the doctrine of hell. And I'm trying not to get too much in the weeds on that,
yeah,
honestly.
because
I want to
there's
get in the
plenty
weeds
out
a little
there.
bit.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, but for me, I'm a little bit more interested in how has this affected us, and how do we
I
need to
like that.
rethink the Christian story a bit as well. I mean, you're probably aware of many other ways of viewing the atonement other than
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
the penal substitutionary way, but the primary way that most American Christians think about the cross and the resurrection is the
Hmm.
way that God made it possible for us
Yeah.
to not go to hell.
Yeah. Very
um,
transactional. Yeah.
very much transactional, yeah, as opposed to transformational, which
Boom.
I think is what, we want. And as a result, though, a lot of, I think, deconstructing Christians, they don't have much of a place for the cross in their spirituality.
Hmm.
And that's really understandable because it has been used as a bit of a weapon. Torture porn, justifying suffering, telling queer people they need to just take up their cross and follow Jesus, which meant be celibate and deny who you are as a person. And so for some people, the cross is this very punishing idea, and because it's a story of punishment.
Yeah.
The cross is what God does,
Yep.
and would do to you if you didn't repent, but instead God will do it to Jesus.
Yeah. In your place.
Right. And so I think, seeing it differently, that the cross is what people do, and um, but then, even then, how do we see value in the cross? So, like,
Hmm.
I'm actually still wrestling through my chapter about the cross right now, so it's kind of front of mind. But I was just doing a lot of reading on Martin Luther King and his spirituality, and the
Mm.
cross is very central in his spirituality. And if you read his sermons, in like the book Strength to Love is a collection of his sermons, amazing book, amazing sermons. He talks about the cross a ton. Never once as like a thing where God's going to punish you. He doesn't talk about hell. The cross for him was a vision of God's love that motivated him to live a life of love for others, knowing that God was on his side, regardless of what happened to him. So, like, for instance, when people bombed his house, the house of his wife and daughter, and they were okay, but like an angry mob came together to try to have vengeance on that. And he said, no, we're going to love. And he basically said, like, listen, whatever happens to me, God is with our movement. Like, where did that idea come from? I think it came from the idea of the cross and resurrection. Whatever happens, like, God is with us. That's what the resurrection shows us, is that when the worst happens, as we fight for the kingdom of God, we know what side God is on.
Yeah.
Um,
That is
that's
so,
beautiful.
I resonate with that so deeply. I just finished, as a matter of fact, on the way to the conference, I finished James Cone book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree.
Oh boy.
And I had started it before and then kind of put it back down. But it's that idea of solidarity, right?
Yeah.
It's they see the cross as solidarity, not punishment. It's what God suffers with us, not to us.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. That's the book that I've been rereading. I've read it a
Mm,
few years ago, and I have it right in front of me. That's one of my main resources for this chapter, because I think that, again, like, the cross for so many of us is this distant spiritual idea, this transactional thing that was not really anchored in Jesus's life and mission. But the cross had everything to do. Like, if you ask, why did Jesus die? Well, Jesus died for the same reason that Jesus lived. Jesus was living in a radical countercultural way to bring about the kingdom of God, social transformation in the world, and living that way can get you killed.
yeah.
That's why Jesus died. He was executed for the way that he lived. And I think, again, like, removing it and making it this thing, this spiritual thing for God, like, we forget, like, the historicity of it. And so I think anchoring it in, like, something like
Mm.
the lynching tree, and seeing, like, no, this is like what the world does, and that the world is still doing.
Still doing.
Yeah, like, when we look at, you mentioned trans people, and like right now, when we ask who are the crucified people in society, we
Mm.
can look globally, at people experiencing genocide in Gaza.
Yeah. 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 Congo,
Where
Haiti.
is God? Where is God, and where are we supposed to be? It's always with the crucified ones.
Yeah.
That's where God is. That's where we're supposed to be. And it's with it is with trans lives. And so we have the sad thing is like we have as a society like the capability to be like have this global vision. We have the numbers, we have the technology, like we can do so much for the marginalized people, but instead we're still crucifying people. We're still fighting about whether trans people should exist. Um, but I think that's what, yeah, I think that's what living out the cross looks like now is asking like where it would God be, you know? And because God is always on the cross.
I love that. Well, let me just go ahead and say it now that when you're looking for your launch team, holler, because I'd love to be a part of that. And then we definitely want to have you back to talk about that book when it comes out because it sounds like it's going to be
I'm excited.
yeah, I don't know. I'm sitting here thinking I read a ton of stuff. I love to read. And the only book that I think even comes close to addressing that, I don't know if you've read it, is Bradley Jersak's
Oh yeah.
A More Christ-like God.
Oh no.
Uh,
Okay. I've read Her Gates Will Never Be Shut, which is a
that
book
one
about
too.
hell.
Yeah, that's a good
Um,
one. But
and
yeah, I can't think of anything that approaches it like that.
And I'm probably not going to say anything brand new. You know, I think all of us are, I think depending on what question we're bringing, when you write a book, you're standing on the shoulders of giants and
Oh,
you learn
100%.
from Richard Rohr and all these different folks. But I'm trying to put something together even for myself because I
Yeah,
inherited a spirituality of fear and punishment. That was for me, Christianity. The Christian spirituality meant um, love God or else God's going to punish you. Love your neighbor, and that means trying to convert your neighbor.
yeah,
And I wasn't even told to love myself, right? And
yeah.
so my spiritual practices were all around avoiding punishment for myself and trying to save you, my neighbor, from punishment. And as a result of that, I couldn't really love you. I couldn't listen to you or learn from you. I thought it was my job to save you. Meanwhile, I'm afraid for my own soul because I'm going to stand before an angry God, right? And so that's just such a dark spirituality. And I'm overstating it a little bit. And I think there are evangelicals who probably talk about it in slightly better ways than that. But I think ultimately that's where the
That's what it
theology
boiled down
brings you.
to. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's what it boiled down to. I love that. I can't wait. Is there a do you have a deadline?
Yeah, I need to get on my manuscript by September, and then it's supposed to come out the following October.
Oh, right
I'm
on.
hoping to get it a lot sooner than that. I don't know if the date can come up if I have the manuscript to them a lot sooner. I'm getting close to having enough words, and now I just need to go back through and just make sure it's
Uh-huh.
all. Yeah. It's been a
Yeah.
fun process though, and it's been nice that I was able to take a little sabbatical away. You know, after I was a pastor, I was a project manager for a bit just to like have something, and I did not
Mhm.
find a lot of joy there. And so I was able to take a break for a few months to write this thing. And honestly, I don't know what I'm going to do on the other side of this. Um, I will have to do something. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of question marks as to what the future holds, but I'm excited I'm trying to be living by faith right now. So,
Yeah, yeah, I feel that. That's awesome. Brian, I don't want to take up any more of your time, but I will tell you that if you need anybody any other eyes reading anything,
okay.
I will volunteer my eyes. I've done that a few times. But I can't wait for that. And we'll have you back on to talk about that. Man, it was really good to talk to you. I really I appreciate your honesty. I appreciate your humility and I'm not trying to butter you up or anything, but for me personally, like I can't speak to anybody else's experience, but because we share that common background, it means a lot to watch you tell your story the way that you do now. Like it gives me permission to keep digging, right? Like I don't know if that's the right way to phrase it, but man, it does. And it just I love you for it. And so just really thank you, all of it.
I appreciate
Yeah.
that, Joe.
Yeah,
Great to
dude.
meet you.
Yeah.
Awesome
So
talking.
yeah, and we'll have all of your links in the show notes. You're at all of the things that like Brian Recker. It's just your name, right?
Yeah, BE Recker is my Instagram
That's
handle.
it.
My
Yeah.
middle name is Eugene. That's why BE Recker.
Okay.
And yeah, my website is, I don't really do much with it, but that's brianrecker.com. You can find me there.
Okay, cool. Yeah, we'll have all that in the show notes. So seriously, if you're not following Brian, go to the show notes, click the links, and then go follow him. I promise you, you won't be disappointed. Or maybe you will be. And that's
Yeah,
part of
no
the
fun.
point. Maybe you will be. That's part of the point.
Not
But
for
Brian,
everybody.
yeah, and that's okay. And that's totally okay. Brian, just again, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to come on and talk with us and share your story.
Appreciate you, man.
Yeah. All right, everybody. That was another awesome episode of Shift Happens and beautiful conversation. I'll just say it again. If you've got a story to share and you're ready to share it, please reach out and we'll set up a time to connect. All right. Thanks, everybody, for following along. I hope that you're having a beautiful day. Get out of here. Go love on some people.